Ryan here with the very first review from the gents at Dapper Gaming, which is just me, Tyler. And we're here with our very first review. We're going to be reviewing, I'm going to be reviewing Pikmin 3, which at this point is a couple weeks old, but I don't give a damn. So, Pikmin 3 might just be the Wii U's first killer app, or even major release at this point. Personally, I consider Monster Hunter 3U to be the Wii U's first great game, like it's a must-have. I bought my Wii U just for Monster Hunter, but I could completely understand why most people would consider the first must-have to be Pikmin 3. For those of you who have not played a Pikmin game before, Pikmin is an action RTS game where you play a humanoid alien, in this case 3 different Copian scientists, who control Pikmin, small plant-like creatures. By using the Pikmin, you complete puzzles, defeat hostile creatures, and collect things to take back to your home planet. Pikmin 3 opens up with a cinematic talking about the planet of Copai, a planet inhabited by human-like creatures who have exhausted the resources of their planet and in a final chance to save it, are in search of other planets which have food, specifically fruit, so that they may take the seeds back to their home planet and grow new sources of food. A crew of 3 is sent to the planet PNF 404 in order to harvest the planet's fruit and return the seeds home, but they crash land when approaching the planet, and the 3 crew members, Elf, Charlie, and Brittany, are split up, and their spaceship, the SS Drake's cosmic drive key, is lost, leaving them stranded on the planet until it is recovered. It's a really standard story by this point for Pikmin games. It's pretty much the same as the first 2. Except the first 2 don't involve the Copians. The first thing I noticed when I started playing Pikmin 3 is that it is gorgeous. Right from the opening menu screen, the game amazed me with how gorgeous it is. Pikmin has always gone for a realistic style that is juxtaposed by cartooniness of the Pikmin, Captain Olimar, and the various creatures you fight, such as the Bulborbs. The move to HD and the extra power the Wii U has over the Wii really lets this graphic style shine. The lighting in Pikmin 3 is beautiful, and I think that is the most obvious change graphically from the previous 2 Pikmin games. And really just the most obvious change in all the games Nintendo has put out so far on the Wii U. The lighting effects in the new 2D Mario game, in Nintendo Land, and in Pikmin 3 are all awesome. Even if the Wii U is a system only marginally more powerful than Microsoft and Sony's 7th gen consoles, it's really clear that Nintendo knows what to do with that power. Fidelity-wise, though, the game does have a few issues, but they're barely noticeable. The 2 specific things I'm speaking of is that some things have noticeably lower resolution textures. Sometimes the ground textures are just, they're lower res than, let's say, a piece of fruit, enemy creatures, or plants. The other thing I noticed is a lack of anti-aliasing. I don't think most people would ever notice this, though, but I was playing the game on my PC monitor, not on my TV, so I was like only a foot or 2 away from the game, which made it visible. The jaggies weren't abundant or hugely noticeable, it's just that I was sitting pretty close. Overall, Pikmin 3 is a damn impressive looking game for a console. I can't think of any console games that look as good as Pikmin 3. The environment and the level design in Pikmin 3 is also fantastic. There are so many parts of this game's levels that I can vividly remember because I just love the look. Probably my favorite looking part of the entire game is like this little waterfall you can walk under. Sometimes games have parts of their worlds that are impressive looking, but Pikmin 3 has so many areas that are just really memorable. More than any other game I can think of. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Pikmin 3 is a stunning looking game, and the developers definitely knew this. One of the smallest features this game has is also one of its most pleasant. There's a built-in camera that your crew members can use to take pictures and post on Miiverse. Since the level design is so great, it's nice just having some way to capture the environment without having a capture card. I'm also becoming more impressed and more involved with Miiverse over time. Nintendo somehow manages to make Miiverse integration completely different with each game they release. In New Super Mario Bros. U, you leave comments on levels and give tips. In Game & Wario, they ask you to draw pictures of words they give you. And in Pikmin 3, they make you a photographer. Even if Miiverse isn't really part of the game, I'm actually enjoying using it. So let's actually talk about what's important, though. the game. Pikmin 3 has introduced 2 new Pikmin, while essentially getting rid of 2 others. We now have Rock Pikmin and Flying Pikmin. Rock Pikmin's bodies are a rock. Since they're obviously much harder than other Pikmin, they can be used to break glass walls or enemy shells. They also do more damage to enemies from being thrown, but do a lot less damage in their regular attack. And they're slower than the other types of Pikmin. Flying Pikmin can fly. That means they carry things back to your ship while going right over rivers and cliffs, which makes them much faster carriers. They're also easier to attack flying creatures with. Flying Pikmin, though, easily have the least health and do the least damage, making them fairly fragile. They're also harder to replace than other types of Pikmin, which makes them more valuable. In single player, white and purple Pikmin have been removed. However, they do remain in the multiplayer. And, by the way, the multiplayer missions and boss rushes are playable by yourself or with a friend, but only locally. Pikmin 3 has no online play. Now, the actual gameplay hasn't been changed much besides the addition of the 2 new Pikmin types. You still run your squad around avoiding creatures' telegraphed attacks and attempting to throw Pikmin on their weak points to slowly headbutt away. Actually, I sort of always have imagined like Pikmin as these carnivorous monsters that bite chunks out of the enemy and by overwhelming numbers manage to kill creatures. They're like trapjaw ants. Pikmin is just super dark. The gameplay, though, is not much different from the previous Pikmin games, but it's been refined. There are small changes, slight improvements. There's really only one major improvement, though, and it's balance. Balance in Pikmin 3 is much better. Pikmin 1 I remember being really hard to beat. The time limit always felt really strict, which made fighting some larger creatures stressful because you had to beat them before the end of the day or they just reset. And you only had so many days before you just lost the game. It was a really hard game at the time. Pikmin 2 was the complete opposite. Pikmin 2 was way too forgiving. There was no day limit, basically, and you could just grind away day after day until you eventually beat the game. Pikmin 3 sort of merged both of these worlds. You sort of have a day limit. The amount of days your crew can survive is determined by the amount of juice you have stored. In order to get more juice, you need to collect fruit. Bigger pieces of fruit provide more juice. And when you run out of fruit, you starve to death. PNF 404 has 66 pieces of fruit spread across 4 levels. So you can survive essentially for 70 to 80 days because some pieces of fruit will fill up more than 1 ration of juice while others won't fill up an entire ration of juice. This is a way better way to put a time limit on the campaign than the arbitrary number of days placed on you in Pikmin 1, and it's better than basically excluding it like they did in Pikmin 2. Bosses have also been balanced to sit nicely between Pikmin 1 and Pikmin 2. Boss's health does not reset at the end of the day, but they're harder than they were in Pikmin 2. If the boss health reset, this game would be enraging. Specifically on the last couple of bosses, because you either need to get bombs, which there are only a certain amount of on the map, close enough to the boss to actually get and use on the boss before the day ends, or on the last boss just because he has a ton of health and heals during the fight that I just can't see a way to defeat him in a single day. I only really have 2 complaints though regarding Pikmin 3. The controls are sort of clumsy. At times the game requires moving well, aiming somewhat precisely, usually for boss fights, and given the camera angle and how aiming and moving works in the game, it's just not easy to do. Both moving your squad leader and aiming the Pikmin use the same thumbstick at the same time. There is a lock-on feature, but it isn't great. It's good, but if you want to hit moving targets, the lock-on really won't help you because you need to lead the target. Using the gamepad definitely hurt my experience, but using the Wiimotes didn't really improve it much either because you're required to go back and forth between using the Wiimote to issue orders and using the gamepad to get squad data. I don't think a game like this will ever really work well on a console, at least not if it's using joysticks. However, the game is definitely more than playable control-wise. They aren't the worst thing to ever happen to gaming. They're far from it, really. They're reasonably smooth, they flow well, but are mostly just lacking precision. The controls really just have the same problems the controls for Pikmin 1 and Pikmin 2 already had. However, I will say that the controls are definitely better using the Wiimotes in Pikmin 3 than they were in Pikmin 2, just because the motion tracking, or I guess the motion controls, are just a lot better on the Wii U than they were on the Wii. The other complaint is length. Pikmin 3 is not a very long game. It took maybe 6 to 7 hours to beat Pikmin 3, and I'm maybe 2 more away from completing it. The game is pretty short. It isn't that much of an issue though, at least personally. Even though the game is short, it has a local multiplayer, and the single player has more than enough replayability in my opinion, because all the boss fights require different strategies and are hard to master. Even if you have no intention of replaying the game, I feel the length is appropriate. No parts of the game drag on in order to extend the game's length, which to me is definitely a bonus. There are so many games now which have you repeating the same tasks over and over just to add content in order to pad out the game's length. But it isn't good content, it's just filler. Pikmin 3 is all good content. There is no filler in this game. The only content that isn't great is the dialogue in the spaceship, which frustratingly isn't skippable and is delivered in tiny text boxes. But the quality of the experience provided by Pikmin 3 easily makes up for the game's length. Even if Pikmin 3 is only 6 hours long, it's some of the best 6 hours of gaming I've had all year. Pikmin 3 at this point is easily in my top 10 of the year, and if it's a sign of the quality of games to be released for the Wii U by Nintendo this fall and winter, then I think the Wii U will hands down have the strongest library of games of all the 8th gen consoles for the remainder of 2013 and likely the majority of 2014. I've loved my time so far with Pikmin 3. I really do have a hard time thinking of a console game, besides Monster Hunter games, that I've enjoyed this much. And with that, I should probably wrap this thing up with a score. Pikmin 3 gets an 8 out of 10. Thank you guys for watching and listening. I've been Ryan. Remember to rate, sub, comment, and such. And hopefully we will have more reviews in the future.